welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle an issue that you might not be familiar with.
Right.
There's a really important one. We're talking about discrimination against Madhesis in Nepal.
Yeah, and it's not a small group we're talking about either.
Right.
The Madhesi make up about a third of Nepal's population.
Wow.
Mostly living in the Terai region,
Okay.
which is that flat, fertile area bordering India.
Right. And here's the thing. Despite their deep roots in Nepal, they're often seen as outsiders, almost like they don't belong.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that perception has unfortunately been fueled by policies that have historically favored the hill communities, leading to political exclusion and a sense of alienation among the Madhesi people.
So in this deep dive, we're going to really dive into the historical context of this discrimination.
Okay.
We'll unpack how it plays out in economic, social, and political ways.
Right.
And we'll even look at the Madhesh movement and what the government's doing or not doing about it.
And you might be surprised by some of the protest tactics the Madhesis have used.
Oh, really?
Think donkey demonstrations.
Donkey demonstrations.
Yeah.
Okay, I already know this is going to be fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's start with the historical roots.
Okay.
When we say Madhesh, what does that even mean in the context of Nepal?
That's a great place to start. So the term Madhesh itself actually points to a long history.
Okay.
Connecting the region to the heartland of North India. So imagine this. You have this region that's geographically and culturally linked to India, but it's politically part of Nepal.
Oh, wow.
And that's where the tension begins.
So it's almost like a cultural crossroads.
Yes.
But that also makes them vulnerable to being seen as different, right?
Exactly. And historically, policies have often favored the hill communities over the Madhesi. You can trace this back to the unification of Nepal in the 18th century, where the hill elites consolidated power.
So imagine you're a Madhesi person living in Nepal.
Right.
Your community has been here for centuries.
Yeah.
But you're constantly being told you're not Nepali enough because of your cultural ties to India.
And this isn't just some abstract historical concept.
Right.
This feeling of being othered has real-world consequences, especially when you look at the development in the Terai region.
Okay.
It lags behind other areas, leading to widespread poverty.
And to add insult to injury.
Yeah.
There was even a period where many Madhesis were denied citizenship certificates.
That's right. And without those certificates, basic rights like owning land or securing a decent job were out of reach.
Wow.
It was a bureaucratic nightmare that trapped many in a cycle of poverty.
I can see how this historical baggage lays the groundwork for the discrimination we see today.
Yeah.
But let's unpack that further.
Sure.
How does this play out in the economic realities of Madhesi people today?
Well, remember that statistic about 45% of Madhesh districts experiencing poverty?
Right.
That's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
It's a direct result of these historical and ongoing inequalities.
Right. It's not just about the historical context. It's about the systems in place, and now W,
Exactly.
that continue to disadvantage them.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the key factors contributing to this economic disparity?
One of the sources we have tells the story of a Madhesi woman who was denied a loan to start her own business.
Oh, wow.
Because she lacked proper land ownership documents.
Wow. So even if you have the drive and the skills,
Right.
the system is rigged against you from the start.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this lack of access to land ownership is directly tied to those citizenship issues we discussed earlier.
Right.
Without citizenship, owning land becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
So it's like this. You're denied the economic foundation to build a life, then blamed for being impoverished.
Right.
That's incredibly frustrating.
And unfortunately, this is just one facet of the discrimination they face.
Right.
We haven't even touched on the social and political barriers yet.
All right, well, let's move on to those then.
Okay.
If we think about the social dimension, language seems like a significant hurdle. You mentioned earlier that Nepali is the dominant language, but many Madhesi people speak other languages.
Right.
How does that create a barrier?
Imagine you're a Madhesi child, you're starting school, excited to learn, but the language spoken in the classroom is completely unfamiliar.
Oh, wow.
You're immediately at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about learning ABCs,
Right.
It's about accessing information, understanding the world around you, and feeling like you belong.
That's such a critical point.
Yeah.
Language is more than just words.
Right.
It's about cultural identity and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And when your language is marginalized,
Yeah.
it's like A part of you is being silenced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It limits your opportunities for education, for
Yeah.
social integration, and for economic advancement.
And this isn't just a hypothetical situation.
Right.
One of the articles we have cites a study showing that Madhesi children who are not fluent in Nepali have significantly lower educational attainment rates compared to their peers.
It's a real problem with real consequences.
And when you layer on top of that the existing patriarchal norms in Nepalese society,
Yeah.
you can see how Madhesi women are doubly disadvantaged.
Right.
They face discrimination based on both their ethnicity and their gender.
That makes me think of an article we read about the challenges Madhesi women face when trying to access health care.
Yeah.
Many of them rely on traditional healers because they can't communicate their needs to doctors who only speak Nepali.
That's a perfect example of how these different layers of discrimination intersect and create incredibly difficult circumstances for certain groups.
Right.
So we've talked about the economic and social dimensions of discrimination.
Yes.
What about the political landscape?
Okay.
Is there a space for Madhesi voices in Nepalese politics?
That's where things get really complicated. Historically, the Madhesi have been largely excluded from positions of power.
Right.
They're underrepresented in government, and their concerns are often ignored.
One of the most shocking things I learned is that for a long time, many Madhesi people were outright denied the right to vote.
Right.
Wow.
And this is in a country that claims to be a democracy.
Right.
Imagine being denied your fundamental right to participate in the political process
Wow.
simply because of your ethnicity.
It's a blatant injustice.
It's like they're being told you're part of Nepal, but you don't get a say in how it's run.
And when they do try to raise their voices and demand their rights, they often face a harsh response from the authorities.
That's right.
Like the incident mentioned in one of our sources where a peaceful protest by Madhesi activists was met with police brutality.
There have been numerous reports of police using excessive force against Madhesi protesters.
Wow.
Further fueling tensions and mistrust.
So it's a catch-22.
Yeah.
They're denied political power, and when they protest for their rights, they're met with violence.
Right.
It's a recipe for unrest.
And it's this very environment of frustration and oppression that gave rise to the Madhesi movement.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more about this movement.
Okay.
When did it emerge?
So,
And what were its goals?
the Madhesi movement really gained momentum in 2007 after the end of the Nepalese Civil War.
Okay.
People were hopeful for change for a more inclusive Nepal. And the Madhesi saw this as their opportunity to demand their rights.
So what were those core demands? What were they fighting for?
Well, their demands were actually pretty straightforward.
Really?
They wanted federalism,
Right.
a system where the Madhesi region would have more autonomy and control over its own affairs.
That makes sense given that feeling of being marginalized by the central government.
Exactly. They also wanted proportional representation in government,
Okay.
basically ensuring that the number of Madhesi representatives in parliament reflected their actual population size. Right.
And of course, they wanted an end to all forms of state-sponsored discrimination against the Madhesi people.
So pretty fundamental demands for a fair and equitable society.
Right.
But how did they go about making those demands heard? Did they stage protests, organize rallies?
They did all of that, but they also got really creative with their protest tactics.
Okay.
This is where the donkey demonstrations come in.
Okay, I've been waiting for this.
Yeah.
What's the story behind the donkey demonstrations?
One of our sources describes a protest where Madhesi activists dressed donkeys in official government attire and paraded them through the streets.
That's hilarious. I can't even imagine seeing a bunch of donkeys in suits and ties.
Right.
What was the point of that?
It was satire at its finest.
Okay.
They were mocking the government,
Oh,
essentially saying, you're so incompetent that even donkeys could do your job better.
brilliant. And it obviously got people's attention.
It did. It was a way to make their point in a memorable and attention-grabbing way.
Right. They also held lamp rallies.
Hmm.
Imagine thousands of people marching through the streets at night,
Wow.
each holding a flickering lamp.
That's beautiful.
It was visually stunning and incredibly powerful.
These tactics are so smart. They tap into something deeper, something emotional.
Mm-hmm.
But were these tactics effective in bringing about real change?
That's the complex part.
Yeah.
While these protests did put the Madhesi issue on the national agenda, translating that attention into concrete policy changes has been an uphill battle.
What were some of the challenges the movement faced?
One major challenge was internal division.
Okay.
There were multiple Madhesi groups with sometimes conflicting goals and strategies.
Right.
This fragmentation weakened their bargaining power.
That makes sense. It's much harder to present a united front when there are internal disagreements.
Right.
Did the government make any concessions in response to the movement?
They did make some promises.
Okay.
There were talks of constitutional amendments to address Madhesi concerns, and they even passed the Police Adjustment Act, which was supposed to integrate Madhesi people into the police force and address issues of police brutality.
So there was some movement, at least on paper, but was it enough to satisfy the demands of the Madhesi people?
Not really.
Right.
One of our sources.
Yeah.
A report from a human rights organization points out that the implementation of these reforms has been incredibly slow and often ineffective.
Wow.
The Police Act, for example, is still not fully operational, years after it was passed.
So it sounds like a lot of talk and not enough action?
Yeah.
Did this lead to further protests and unrest?
It absolutely did.
Oh, wow.
The Madhesi people felt betrayed, like their concerns were being ignored.
Right.
They continued to organize protests, but the government's response became increasingly heavy-handed.
One article we read described a particularly disturbing incident in Simrangad, where police opened fire on a Madhesi protest, killing several people.
That's right. The government imposed curfews, restricted freedom of assembly.
Wow. And even shut down internet access in Madhesi areas to try to control the narrative.
To basically silencing them.
It was a clear sign that they were more interested in silencing dissent than engaging in meaningful dialogue.
So you have this cycle of protests and repression, and all the while the Madhesi community continues to suffer from economic hardship, social exclusion, and political marginalization.
Exactly. It's a complex situation with no easy solutions.
It sounds like the Madhesi people are caught in a web of systemic discrimination.
Right.
With very few avenues for redress.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I'm curious about something.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the Madhesh movement. But what about the role of women in this struggle?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
Madhesi women are at the forefront of this movement. Despite facing even greater barriers than their male counterparts, they're organizing protests, leading community initiatives, and advocating for change at all levels. That makes me think of an interview we read with a Madhesi woman who was leading a campaign to register women voters in her village.
Yes.
She talked about how she faced threats and intimidation.
Right.
But she refused to back down because she believed in the power of women's voices.
It's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
These women are challenging not just ethnic discrimination, but also deeply entrenched patriarchal norms that limit their participation in public life.
And they're doing this while facing the same economic hardship, social exclusion, and political violence that affects the entire Madhesi community.
Right.
It's remarkable.
It really highlights the intersectionality of these issues.
Yeah.
How different forms of oppression can overlap and create even more challenging circumstances for certain groups.
So what does all this mean for the future of Nepal? Can a nation truly be unified when a significant portion of its population feels marginalized and excluded?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Can true national unity exist when such a large portion of the population feels unheard and unseen?
It really makes you think about what unity actually means.
Right.
Is it just about everyone living within the same borders?
Yeah.
Or is it about something more?
It has to be about more than just geography.
Right.
True unity requires a sense of shared identity, a feeling that everyone belongs and has a stake in the nation's future.
And right now, it doesn't sound like the Madhesi people feel that sense of belonging. They're being told they're Nepali, but they're not being treated as equals.
One of our sources, a scholar who studies ethnic conflict, argues that this kind of exclusion and marginalization can actually be a breeding ground for instability and unrest.
That makes sense.
Right.
When people feel like they have no voice and no legitimate means of expressing their grievances, they're more likely to resort to other means.
And that's something the Nepalese government needs to take seriously. They need to understand that addressing the concerns of the Madhesi people isn't just about being nice or politically correct. It's about ensuring the long-term stability and prosperity of the entire nation.
So what steps can the government take to move towards a more inclusive and equitable Nepal?
Well, for starters, they need to fully implement those reforms they've already promised.
Right.
The Police Act, for example, needs to become fully operational, and there needs to be accountability for those instances of police brutality against Madhesi protesters.
And it can't just be about top-down reforms. They need to create spaces for genuine dialogue with Madhesi leaders and community members.
Exactly.
They need to listen to their concerns and work collaboratively to find solutions.
And they need to invest in the development of the Terai region.
Okay.
Improve infrastructure, create economic opportunities, and ensure that Madhesi people have equal access to education, healthcare, and other essential services.
It sounds like a pretty big to-do list.
It is, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
There are many examples from around the world where countries have successfully addressed similar issues of ethnic and regional inequality.
So there's hope.
Yeah.
But it's going to take a concerted effort from both the government and the Madhesi community to bridge this divide.
Right.
What about the international community?
Yeah.
Can they play a role in this process?
Absolutely. International pressure can be a powerful tool for change.
Yeah.
Organizations like the United Nations and human rights groups can monitor the situation in Nepal,
Okay.
report on human rights abuses, and advocate for the rights of marginalized groups.
And countries like India, which shares a close relationship with Nepal, can also exert their influence to encourage inclusive policies and protect the rights of the Madhesi people.
Right. It's important to remember that this isn't just an internal Nepalese issue.
Right.
It has regional and even global implications.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've explored the historical roots of discrimination against Madhesis in Nepal, how it manifests in their daily lives,
Right.
the emergence of the Madhesh movement,
Yeah.
and the challenges they face in their fight for equality.
And we've talked about the complex path toward a more just and inclusive Nepal.
Right.
It's a journey that's far from over. But I think it's important to remember that change is possible.
That's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
We've thrown a lot of information your way, but we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and left you with a deeper understanding of this often overlooked issue.
And if you're interested in learning more, there are many resources available online.
Right.
You can find articles, reports, and even personal accounts from Madhesi activists and community members.
And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to get involved in supporting the Madhesi people's fight for justice and equality.
Every voice counts, and even small actions can make a difference.
So keep diving deep, stay curious, and never stop questioning the world around you.
Great advice.
That's it for today's Deep Dives. Thanks for joining.